In the middle of World War II, while bombs fell across Europe, a strange discovery inside a Hollywood studio exposed a hidden enemy, one that didn't fight with weapons, but with moving pictures. How could a film reel become more dangerous than a bullet? And who was truly controlling the story? Spring 1942. While American troops prepared for battles across Europe and the Pacific, another front of the war opened far closer to home. Inside the motion picture studios of California. On the Warner Brothers lot, between sets built for westerns and musicals, a quiet government contractor arrived under the cover of routine film inspection. His name was Vincent Morgan, a former professor of visual psychology from New York University, recently reassigned to a newly formed division under the Office of War Information. His specialty was subtle persuasion, the science of how images shape the human mind. Morgan had spent months analyzing captured German newsreels recovered from ships seized near Lisbon. At first glance, they looked like standard European theater updates: soldiers marching, parades, speeches. But something about them disturbed him deeply. The rhythm, the pacing, even the lighting seemed engineered for more than information. It was control through cinema. Inside a small projection room, Morgan ran the reels again and again. Frame by frame, he noticed a pattern. Smiles of children were followed by banners of the Reich. Farmers shone in peace, then in triumph. The sequence wasn't random. It followed precise emotional cues designed to bypass logic and stir obedience. By early May, Morgan's report reached Washington. His conclusion was alarming. Germany was winning the psychological war, not on the battlefield, but in the hearts of millions watching their films. The captured material revealed something more sinister. Intelligence had found marginal notes written in English on some of the reels, edits that weren't made in Berlin. Someone had been reviewing, even modifying, these films before they reached Europe. Morgan realized what it meant. Nazi propaganda experts had been studying American cinema, dissecting Hollywood storytelling to perfect their own tools of influence. The evidence suggested that Joseph Goebbels, Germany's Minister of Propaganda, had ordered detailed studies of American film structure years before the war began. His analysts learned from American techniques, pacing, emotion, heroism, and then twisted them into instruments of totalitarian control. Morgan's memo was blunt. "The enemy understands our language of dreams," he wrote, "and he is using it against us." Within weeks, a classified meeting was arranged in Washington. Inside a guarded conference room, representatives from major studios, Warner Brothers, RKO, Paramount, gathered around government officials. The tone was urgent. Morgan presented his findings with the precision of a scientist and the gravity of a soldier. On the screen behind him flickered scenes from the German film Triumph of the Will. The audience saw mass rallies, coordinated movement, and hypnotic symmetry. Morgan explained how each element was built to generate submission, not understanding. Even the shadows and camera angles were part of the design. The studio executives watched in silence as Morgan switched reels. Next came a German newsreel filmed in neutral Spain. Scenes of cheerful workers and peace under German order. The narration was in English. The film had been screened in South American cinemas under the name The New Europe, presented as an independent production. To the men in that room, the realization was chilling. German propaganda had infiltrated American and Latin markets, often disguised as cultural or travel films. Some had even been distributed through secondary American companies that never knew the origin of the reels. Morgan closed the presentation with a warning. "We are not the only ones telling the story of this war. And if we lose control of that story, we may lose the war itself." The War Department understood the stakes. Morale was fragile. Many Americans were still uncertain about how far the war would go, or how long it would last. A single powerful narrative, repeated enough times, could shift public opinion, perhaps even discourage support for the fight ahead. By the end of the meeting, a decision was made quietly but decisively. Hollywood would no longer be a bystander in the war of images. It would become a strategic partner in the nation's psychological defense. A new liaison office was formed to coordinate film content and messaging under the banner of the Office of War Information. Officially, it was about information alignment. Unofficially, it was the opening of a propaganda counteroffensive. As Morgan returned to Los Angeles, he carried a locked briefcase containing copies of the German reels. But hidden among them was one film unlike the others, a supposed entertainment short distributed in New York months earlier. The style was American, but the dialogue was not. It carried subtle anti-Allied sentiment and glorified the efficiency of authoritarian control. The investigation traced it back to a now-vanished production company registered under false names. Its investors had fled the country in 1939, yet their work had already circulated across dozens of small-town theaters. To Morgan, it was confirmation of his worst suspicion. The enemy was already inside. From that moment, the war for the American mind began. Silent, invisible, but no less dangerous than the battles raging across Europe. While soldiers carried rifles and tanks across continents, another army worked in the dark rooms and editing bays of California, fighting to protect the truth itself. For the men and women about to join this unseen front, the mission would demand a different kind of courage, one that could not be decorated with medals or measured in victories. Their weapon would be light projected on a screen. Their battlefield, the human imagination, and the first strike had already been made. By the summer of 1942, the discovery inside those captured film reels sent a quiet shock through Washington. What Vincent Morgan had uncovered was not simply propaganda, it was psychological engineering on a global scale. For the first time, American intelligence began to understand that Joseph Goebbels' propaganda ministry was operating with scientific precision. What they called cinema warfare had been perfected long before the first American soldier set foot in Europe. At the center of it was film itself, not as entertainment, but as a weapon of emotion. Goebbels had studied how American films from the 1930s stirred hope during hardship. He analyzed how laughter, music, and heroism united audiences. Then he inverted the formula. In German propaganda, he replaced joy with triumph, unity with obedience, and individual courage with the myth of destiny. The result was hypnotic. Films like Triumph of the Will transformed political ideology into spectacle. Every camera movement reinforced a hierarchy. Every cut erased doubt. The audience did not think, they absorbed. In Berlin, film technicians mapped the emotional flow of each scene the same way generals mapped front lines. They calculated when music should swell, when silence should fall, and when faces should appear in close-up to magnify the illusion of moral clarity. By contrast, American wartime newsreels still followed a journalistic style, objective, informative, and often dry. They reported events, but they didn't command emotion. This was the gap Goebbels exploited. He didn't just tell the German public what to believe, he made them feel it, until belief became reflex. As Allied forces fought in North Africa and the Pacific, another kind of offensive was taking place across the Atlantic. Through neutral countries like Spain, Sweden, and Switzerland, German films slipped into global distribution networks. Some arrived in South America, labeled as cultural exports. Others appeared in small American theaters through private importers. In German-American neighborhoods, civic halls sometimes hosted screenings of what appeared to be historical documentaries or folk celebrations. Behind these harmless titles lay carefully crafted narratives, stories that glorified discipline, efficiency, and national pride while subtly framing democracy as chaotic and weak. The German-American Bund, already active before the war, became one of the channels for these screenings. FBI reports noted small but measurable changes in public sentiment wherever such events were held. Neighbors spoke of orderly Europe, of strong leadership, of decisive government. For Morgan and his colleagues, This was proof that propaganda didn't need to shout to succeed. It only needed repetition. The same ideas, the same images, the same rhythms, over and over, until resistance dissolved. By late 1942, a new report compiled by the Office of War Information mapped the reach of Nazi propaganda throughout the Western Hemisphere. The findings were sobering. Dozens of South American newspapers and film houses had unknowingly published or shown German content designed to soften attitudes toward the Reich. In some cases, local distributors had received funding from shell companies traced to Berlin banks. The goal was not immediate persuasion. It was long-term conditioning, shaping cultural sympathy for Germany while eroding trust in the Allies. One FBI memorandum, declassified decades later, stated it plainly: propaganda does not need to convince. It only needs to make disbelief difficult. Meanwhile, in Hollywood, American filmmakers were struggling to counter the threat. Traditional patriotic shorts, filled with flags and speeches, failed to compete with the emotional sophistication of Nazi productions. People watched them, but they didn't feel them. The propaganda war was turning into a battle of psychology, and America was on the defensive. Morgan returned to his office one evening to review a reel smuggled from Portugal. It appeared to be a neutral film, a romantic travelogue titled Echoes of Europe. Yet its narration praised the new order of the continent and implied that nations under German occupation had rediscovered peace. At the bottom of the reel box was a stamp from an American distributor. It had been scheduled for release in New Jersey, targeting immigrant audiences hungry for news of home. This discovery triggered one of the first domestic censorship alerts of the war. The film was withdrawn, but by then several copies had already circulated privately. The implication was devastating. Nazi propagandists had successfully placed material inside the American market. The enemy had learned to disguise ideology as culture, beauty as a vehicle for control. Behind the walls of the propaganda analysis section in Washington, experts began dissecting every known German film. They charted patterns of rhythm and sound, testing audience reactions through controlled screenings. The results confirmed what Morgan had long suspected. These films targeted emotion, not reason. A sequence of smiling workers, followed by scenes of military parades, produced measurable spikes in viewer pride and trust. When similar images were paired with messages about authority or purity, the reaction intensified. The same techniques were later found in pamphlets, speeches, and radio broadcasts. Propaganda was not isolated to one medium. It was a system of feeling. By autumn, American intelligence intercepted documents showing that German propaganda offices in Buenos Aires and Mexico City were distributing entertainment films to neutral audiences, embedding political subtext in comedies, romances, and newsreels. The line between truth and fiction was dissolving. Morgan's latest briefing ended with a chilling conclusion. They have made entertainment the instrument of belief. Our citizens may already be under its influence and not even know it. In a private note added to the file, one analyst wrote, "The greatest danger is not that people will believe lies. It is that they will stop believing anything at all." That insight changed the strategy. The United States could no longer simply denounce propaganda. It had to compete with it and win. The call went out to select individuals inside the film industry who understood the mechanics of storytelling, rhythm, and audience psychology. The mission was simple in statement, but monumental in execution. Create films powerful enough to break the illusion of Nazi cinema, without revealing that they were part of a government operation. Among those contacted was a man whose work had already thrilled millions with tales of courage and suspense. Hollywood director Frank Lawson. In the months to come, Lawson and his secret team would launch one of the most extraordinary campaigns of the war. A war not fought with bullets or bombs, but with stories, light, and sound. The invisible enemy had been identified. Now, America would begin its counterattack. In October 1942, While headlines spoke of distant battles in North Africa and the Pacific, another kind of recruitment was quietly taking place in Los Angeles. Not on the draft boards or training camps, but inside a private office at Paramount Studios. Frank Lawson, age 42, was one of Hollywood's most dependable directors. He had built a reputation on sharp editing, clear emotion, and stories that moved fast. His films had no message, only momentum. That was precisely why the government came looking for him. Lawson had just wrapped production on an adventure picture when he received an unexpected visitor. The man carried no credentials, no introduction, only a sealed envelope marked Confidential, War Department. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Philip Rhodes, and within hours, Lawson's life changed direction forever. The envelope contained a short letter and a reel of film. No explanation, just a request that Lawson view it alone and report to a government office the next morning. That night, in the dark of his private screening room, Lawson threaded the reel into his projector. The film began like a standard German newsreel, images of captured Allied soldiers. But the narration was unlike anything he had heard. Calm, articulate, persuasive. It didn't mock the Americans. It pitied them. The story claimed they had been betrayed by their leaders, abandoned by their government, victims of their own democracy. The film was not crude. It was masterful. Every edit carried emotion. Every image built trust. By the time the reel ended, Lawson felt something deeper than anger. Fear. He understood at once why he had been chosen. The next morning, Rhodes explained the mission. Washington had authorized a covert unit to counter Nazi psychological warfare through film. They needed directors who understood how to move hearts as well as minds. The task was not to create propaganda that shouted patriotism, but stories that exposed manipulation itself. Propaganda about propaganda. Rhodes spoke plainly. You know how to hold an audience. We need to do that for the truth. Lawson hesitated. He was a filmmaker, not a soldier. He had spent his life avoiding politics. But when Rhodes showed him a photograph of American prisoners forced to appear in German films, reading scripts written by Goebbels' team, Lawson saw a familiar face. It was his younger brother, Henry, missing in North Africa. That moment ended the hesitation. Lawson agreed to serve. Within weeks, he was sworn into a civilian division operating under the Office of War Information. He was assigned a studio building disguised as a storage facility near Sunset Boulevard. Inside, a team began to assemble. Screenwriters, editors, composers, psychologists, and a handful of refugee filmmakers who had escaped from Europe. Every member signed secrecy agreements. No names would appear on credits. No press would mention their existence. Even within the industry, the operation was invisible. The mission objectives were clear but daunting. Create films that dismantled Nazi lies without looking like government propaganda. Make truth more compelling than fiction. For Lawson, this meant unlearning much of what Hollywood had taught him. In entertainment, audiences sought escape. In this new work, they needed confrontation, the courage to face deception and still believe in their country. The first challenge was tone. Too much patriotism felt insincere. Too much exposure risked revealing classified intelligence. The solution lay somewhere between, in narrative technique. The films would not lecture but reveal, guiding audiences to discover truth on their own. Psychologists on the team studied German propaganda patterns. They charted emotional triggers, visual repetition, and linguistic framing. Then they designed counter-strategies. If the enemy used rhythm to induce agreement, Lawson would use rhythm to awaken skepticism. If the enemy built myths, he would expose mechanisms. Morgan, now serving as the unit's chief analyst, joined Lawson in outlining the first experimental script. They called it Project Aurora, the idea that a single burst of light could cut through darkness. The studio supplied what they needed: sound stages, equipment, film stock. The War Department supplied classified footage and intelligence. No one outside the unit understood the purpose. Rumors spread of a morale project. For Lawson, The hardest adjustment was creative. Every instinct told him to dramatize, to heighten emotion. But the mission required restraint. The films had to feel authentic, grounded, and unscripted. They were designed to mirror reality so closely that audiences would forget they were watching government work. Late at night, he would sit in the empty editing room, splicing footage by hand, studying every frame. On one reel, he found a moment of truth: German soldiers listening to a broadcast of their own propaganda. The camera caught their expressions: pride, confusion, fear. It was not staged, it was real. Lawson decided that moment said more about tyranny than any speech could. As production advanced, the team faced moral questions none of them had expected. How far could they bend truth to defend it? Could manipulation be justified in service of freedom? Lawson's answer came in a letter from his brother's unit, recovered through the Red Cross. Henry was alive, but imprisoned. His note ended with a single line: "Make sure the world knows what we fight for." That became Lawson's creed. He ordered it typed and pinned above the editing table. By December, the first test reels were ready. The content was still experimental, but the intent was clear. Hollywood, once known for glamour and fantasy, had now become a front line in the defense of democracy. In the months to come, this small, hidden team would begin decoding the enemy's methods, transforming film theory into a weapon of truth. They would learn that propaganda was not just about lies, it was about power over perception. And to fight it, they would have to master that power themselves. In the winter of 1943, the city of Los Angeles carried on with its glittering distractions: premieres, radio shows, and patriotic bond drives. Yet, behind one locked studio gate, a handful of men and women worked day and night in silence. Their names would never appear on posters. Their mission would never be mentioned in the news. Inside Building 23, an unused sound stage disguised as a warehouse, Frank Lawson's secret film team began their most ambitious task: to decode the cinematic weapons of the Third Reich. The facility's windows were sealed. A single projector threw light onto a whitewashed wall where captured German films played in endless loops. The air smelled of celluloid and dust. Each reel carried layers of meaning, words, images, and emotions built to command obedience. The team's job was to take those layers apart, frame by frame, until they understood the machinery beneath. Among the recruits was Ludwig Bennett, a thin, quiet man with a German accent and the weary eyes of someone who had seen too much. Once an editor at Berlin's UFA studios, he had worked under Joseph Goebbels before fleeing to America in 1939. Now, he was the team's most valuable analyst, the man who could read the enemy's methods from the inside. Bennett explained that Nazi propaganda did not rely on lies alone. It worked through arrangement. Even truthful images could be weaponized if positioned in the right sequence. A smiling farmer followed by a military march created emotional association. Peace achieved through strength. Show it often enough, and strength became virtue itself. He pointed out subtleties the others had never noticed. How cameras were placed slightly below the speaker's eye level to make him seem towering. How the lighting always centered authority figures while civilians remained in shadow. How even the pauses in speeches were timed to synchronize with audience breathing. As they slowed the reels to half speed, Bennett revealed another secret: the rhythm of propaganda. Every 4 seconds, a visual beat changed. It was not accidental. The tempo aligned with the natural rhythm of attention. In psychological terms, it bypassed critical thought. Vincent Morgan confirmed the finding with data from his earlier research. When viewers experienced emotional alignment, excitement, fear, or pride, their analytical resistance dropped. They absorbed messages as feelings, not facts. Goebbels' genius had been to make obedience feel good. The team filled chalkboards with notes, diagrams, and arrows, linking emotion to image. They found that propaganda functioned like music, not a melody of truth, but of influence. Even the background scores had been engineered. Using simple orchestration, German composers employed rhythmic patterns that built tension and release, conditioning the mind to expect satisfaction when the state triumphed on screen. In one reel, a documentary of German industry, the soundtrack swelled each time machines moved in perfect synchronization. The message was clear: unity equals strength, but beneath it ran a secondary cue, the faint hum of a choir, mixed low enough to be felt more than heard. The voice of conformity, hidden inside sound. For Lawson, it was a revelation. "They are not making films," he noted in his private journal. "They are programming emotions." As days turned into weeks, the team's work became more forensic than creative. They dissected films as surgeons dissect anatomy, searching for the nerve that controlled belief. One afternoon, Bennett screened a propaganda short depicting German soldiers rescuing children from bombed villages. The images were tender, human. But then came the cut, the same soldiers marching beneath banners of conquest. The emotional transition was seamless. Compassion flowed into pride. Empathy became justification. This, Bennett explained, was the core of psychological warfare. Conversion through sentiment. The message was not, "We are right." It was, "We feel right." Morgan, studying audience response data, realized the danger extended beyond Germany. Neutral countries and immigrant communities across the Americas were exposed to the same imagery. The threat was global. In a meeting recorded in internal notes, he summarized their challenge. "The enemy understands how to make people love their captors. Our task is to remind them to love their freedom." As they analyzed further, the team discovered something even more unsettling. Many of the techniques in Nazi propaganda originated from American advertising research of the 1920s and 30s, studies in consumer persuasion, emotional suggestion, and crowd behavior. The Reich had simply adapted commercial psychology to political control. It was an uncomfortable truth. America's own innovations in mass communication had been turned against it. The revelation galvanized the team. If those same principles could enslave minds, they could also liberate them. Lawson proposed a new direction. Instead of trying to overpower propaganda with patriotic speeches, they would expose the mechanisms themselves, make the audience see how manipulation worked. Once seen, the illusion would collapse. Bennett agreed, but warned of the risk. The spell breaks only if the viewer wants to wake up. They began developing experimental film sequences that mirrored Nazi editing techniques but reversed their purpose. Instead of leading viewers toward obedience, these films led them toward awareness. A German rally would cut to an American factory scene, the same order, the same rhythm, but with a crucial difference: individuals visible, not crowds. Workers speaking, not marching. The contrast revealed meaning without a single word of commentary. It was cinema turned inside out, propaganda that trained viewers to resist propaganda. But time was running short. Intelligence reports showed that new German films were arriving in neutral ports every week. The psychological war was accelerating, and American audiences were already saturated with foreign material through Latin American channels. In January 1943, the Office of War Information authorized Lawson's team to move from analysis to production. Their assignment: create a counter-propaganda film capable of reversing enemy influence among soldiers and civilians alike. The working title was Divide and Conquer. It would look like a standard war documentary, but beneath its surface lay a hidden weapon: truth, structured with the same precision the enemy used for deception. As the first reels of Divide and Conquer entered editing, Morgan paused at the door of Building 23. Inside, the projector flickered, casting light across faces bent over film strips. He wrote one final line in his report that night: "We have found the enemy's rhythm. Now we must learn to play it better." For the team, the discovery marked a turning point. The study of propaganda had ended. The counterattack was about to begin. By February 1943, the long nights inside Building 23 had transformed from analysis to execution. The walls that once echoed with the hum of projectors now carried the clatter of typewriters, the rhythm of scissors on celluloid, and the low murmur of orchestral tests played on loop. The plan was bold. Frank Lawson's secret team would release a film so ordinary in appearance that no one would suspect its purpose. It would enter theaters through official War Department channels as an educational feature, nothing more. Yet every cut, every sound, every pause would be calculated to counter the hypnotic techniques of Nazi propaganda. The working title remained Divide and Conquer. To the public, it was simply a war documentary. To those inside the operation, it was the first weapon in a new kind of battle, a film designed to make audiences think, not obey. Lawson began by studying the most common German narrative pattern: strength without doubt, victory without cost. His counter-strategy was the opposite: show strength through endurance and victory through struggle. The film would not glorify power, it would reveal its price. The first assembly opened with captured German footage, marching columns, triumphant speeches, banners in motion. Then the narration shifted. Calm, measured, factual. It pointed out inconsistencies invisible on first viewing. The same soldiers filmed weeks apart, recycled as new victories. The same crowd scenes appearing under different city names. The commentary never accused, it simply revealed. Midway through the reel, Lawson inserted scenes of ordinary Europeans living under occupation. Teachers, families, shopkeepers. Their expressions weary but unbroken. The contrast spoke louder than any speech. When the first rough cut was screened for War Department officials, the response was polite but uncertain. The film felt too clinical, too restrained. It lacked emotion. Soldiers watching it might learn something, but they wouldn't feel compelled to act. Lawson returned to his desk disheartened. Weeks of work, and the result was dismissed as a lecture. His team had followed every rule of accuracy, yet they had missed the pulse of persuasion. Then Morgan offered a suggestion drawn from Bennett's earlier analysis. Goebbels never sold facts. He sold feelings. Perhaps we must sell truth the same way. That night, Lawson stayed in the editing room long after midnight. He rewatched the faces in the footage. Civilians glancing upward as bombers passed overhead. Soldiers reading letters from home. He realized the story was not about armies or borders. It was about people and the fragile bond between freedom and faith. The next morning, he ordered a complete redesign. The documentary would keep its structure, but adopt a thriller's pacing. Every segment would end with a question, not an answer. Every reveal would create curiosity before resolution. Composer Helen Raines rewrote the score, replacing triumphal brass with a restrained string motif that swelled only when truth emerged. The rhythm followed a heartbeat, quickening during deception, easing during clarity. Psychologists on the team advised adding emotional anchors, recurring symbols that built subconscious recognition. A light in a window, a hand writing a letter, a flag torn but still standing. Nothing overtly patriotic, just subtle reminders of persistence. The revised cut ran 28 minutes. When screened again, this time for a small group of soldiers at Fort Mason, the reaction was immediate. Silence during the opening reels turned to murmurs as contradictions appeared on screen. When the narration calmly exposed the manipulation behind a German victory montage, laughter broke the tension. Not amusement, but relief at understanding. After the screening, observers noted a striking shift. The soldiers discussed what they had seen, analyzing scenes, pointing out techniques, questioning earlier newsreels. The film had done something rare. It made its audience active, encouraged. The War Department approved limited release across training camps under the guise of orientation material. Civilians would later see it through churches, civic halls, and factory screenings. Distribution was handled with quiet precision. No studio logos, no credits. The reels carried only a plain label, U.S. Government Information Film. For Lawson's team, it was a moment of triumph. Modest, uncelebrated, but historic. Hollywood had entered the war not with glamour, but with intelligence, yet success brought consequences. Within weeks, intelligence intercepts reported increased agitation from Berlin. Joseph Goebbels had personally ordered a review of American morale films. New directives went out to his studios. Portray America as deceitful, its democracy as illusion. The counterattack came swiftly. German broadcasts to neutral countries began airing documentaries showing racial unrest, strikes, and poverty in the United States. The message was simple: freedom breeds chaos. Inside Building 23, the mood turned somber. Their victory had drawn enemy attention, and the next German campaign would be far more dangerous because it used truth itself as its weapon. Still, divide and conquer had proven a point. Propaganda could be fought, not by shouting louder, but by revealing how the shouting worked. The War Department's internal summary recorded it plainly. Audience retention higher than standard newsreel. Emotional engagement sustained. Cognitive skepticism induced. In military terms, it was measurable success. But for the filmmakers, numbers meant little. What mattered was that people were finally questioning what they saw. Lawson kept one of the test screening's comment cards pinned above his desk. A soldier had written only 2 words. "Now I notice." It was the confirmation he needed. The battle for perception could be won, not by blind faith, but by awareness. As spring approached, orders arrived for the next project. Intelligence had learned that Goebbels's ministry was preparing a fresh campaign aimed directly at American credibility. The enemy would use America's own flaws, inequality, division, and doubt as ammunition. Lawson's team would have to strike first again. But this time, truth alone might not be enough. The propaganda war had evolved, and the enemy had just changed the rules. By the summer of 1943, divide and conquer had circulated quietly across American bases, factories, and schools. It was never advertised, never promoted. Yet through whispers and word of mouth, it reached millions. Its impact was undeniable. Audiences no longer absorbed newsreels passively. They watched with awareness, alert to patterns of persuasion. But across the Atlantic, the Ministry of Propaganda in Berlin was already preparing a counterstrike. Reports intercepted through Allied intelligence revealed that Joseph Goebbels was furious. He believed the Americans had turned the art of exposure into a new kind of propaganda, one more dangerous than any battlefield victory. Within weeks, a new German campaign was underway, a series of films and broadcasts designed to reverse the narrative entirely. Instead of portraying America as naive or decadent, these productions presented it as hypocritical. Goebbels' strategy was brilliant and cruel. He instructed his editors to use real images, not fabrications, of America's internal divisions. The reels displayed segregation in public facilities, poverty in industrial cities, strikes and protests against low wages. This time, the propaganda carried truth. Selective truth. Fragments sharpened into weapons. The broadcasts were aimed not only at Europe, but at neutral nations and even South America, where German cultural influence remained strong. One film, titled The Illusion of Freedom, used authentic footage from American newspapers and civic archives. It showed discrimination, unemployment, and dissent, then concluded with the line, "Is this the democracy they promise the world?" When these films began circulating in Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, and Madrid, the effect was immediate. Local editors reprinted their themes. For the first time, German propaganda no longer looked foreign. It looked factual. Inside Building 23, the news struck Lawson's team with quiet dread. They had spent months learning to unmask lies. But now, they faced something far more difficult. Propaganda built from truth. During a late-night meeting, Vincent Morgan presented the intercepted footage on the projector wall. Images of American workers clashing with police, speeches about racial injustice, newspaper headlines of economic disparity. No distortions, no fabrications, all real. The silence that followed was heavier than any before. Frank Lawson finally spoke. "We can't argue with what's true," he said, "but we can argue with what it means." That became their guiding principle. The only way to counter selective truth was context, to reveal that democracy, unlike dictatorship, could admit its flaws and strive to correct them. Still, the idea was controversial. Some officials in Washington feared such an approach would weaken morale. Others argued that honesty was the only enduring defense. Within the team, the debate turned personal. Ludwig Bennett, the refugee editor from Germany, reminded them that Goebbels' genius lay in moral paralysis. "He doesn't want us to lie," Bennett said quietly. "He wants us to doubt ourselves until we say nothing." Those words reshaped their mission. The next project, codenamed Project Mirror, would confront the German attack head-on. The film would begin exactly as Goebbels' propaganda did, showing America's imperfections: segregated schools, struggling workers, divided communities. But instead of hiding these realities, the narration would acknowledge them, openly, soberly, before turning to contrast. The second half would show process, not perfection. Union meetings negotiating better conditions, journalists exposing corruption, citizens debating policy without fear. It would depict democracy not as flawless, but as self-correcting. The team knew it was a risk. In a world conditioned to equate power with certainty, showing vulnerability could be mistaken for weakness. But Lawson insisted that authenticity was America's strongest weapon. Helen Raines crafted a score that echoed this duality, somber at first, then quietly rising as scenes shifted from tension to cooperation. Morgan refined the narration, keeping it factual, reflective, and calm. Every word was chosen to rebuild trust, not provoke pride. When Project Mirror was screened for a test audience of War Department staff, the reaction was uncertain. Some found it uncomfortably honest. Others called it revolutionary. One officer noted, "It tells the truth, and somehow that makes it stronger." Outside the studio, however, the propaganda war was escalating. German shortwave broadcasts reached as far as South America, declaring that America's films were self-deception packaged as virtue. The lines spread fast. Lawson's team worked under growing pressure. Each morning brought new reports of enemy broadcasts undermining their work. Still, they persisted, refining the message that democracy's greatest strength lay not in its image, but in its conscience. The final version of Project Mirror ran 30 minutes. It ended with a single statement read by the narrator: "Freedom is not perfect. It is the right to perfect ourselves." The film premiered quietly in military theaters, then in community centers and universities. To everyone's surprise, it resonated deeply. Viewers didn't see weakness. They saw honesty. Critics later called it a documentary that looked inward and found its courage. For the team, it was more than a film. It was proof that propaganda could be defeated not by more illusion, but by transparency. But victory was fleeting. Days later, new intelligence arrived. German agents operating in South America were building a vast underground network to distribute propaganda films through neutral distributors, using cultural events and art societies as cover. The documents mentioned a name: Werner Krause, a German expatriate controlling film shipments across the continent. The discovery opened a new front in the propaganda war, one that could not be fought from a Hollywood studio. And for the next phase, the Americans would have to go far beyond their own borders. By late 1943, the propaganda war had entered a silent and dangerous phase. American intelligence had confirmed what the team in Building 23 feared most: that German influence was spreading deep into neutral territories, far beyond the reach of U.S. broadcasts or films. The trail pointed south. Across the cities of Buenos Aires, Montevideo, and Santiago, German newsreels and cultural documentaries filled cinemas weekly. Their distributor, Werner Krause, operated under the banner of a legitimate international film company. His shipments arrived through neutral ports, often accompanied by European art films or travel shorts. Hidden within those reels were messages from Goebbels's ministry, subtle, persuasive, and effective. When intelligence agents traced several of Krauss's shipments to theaters showing anti-Allied content, Washington authorized a covert response. The mission was simple in concept, but perilous in execution. Infiltrate the Nazi distribution network, replace select reels with American counter-propaganda, and expose the full scale of the operation. From the beginning, one name stood out as the perfect operative: Maria Vázquez, a 30-year-old Argentine-American film editor from Lawson's team. Fluent in Spanish and German, she understood the craft of editing and the psychology of persuasion. More importantly, she could blend into the industry she was about to enter. Her cover identity was that of a freelance buyer representing South American theaters eager for new material from Hollywood. Armed with forged credentials and a portfolio of genuine film orders, she sailed from New Orleans under civilian status. Only 3 people in the United States knew her true mission. When Vázquez arrived in Buenos Aires in November, the city appeared calm on the surface. Cafes crowded, theaters busy, newspapers lively. Yet beneath that normalcy, German influence was everywhere. Business circles, radio stations, and cultural societies all operating under the same quiet coordination. Within days, she secured a meeting with Werner Krause. The distributor was courteous but calculating, a man who spoke in compliments and measured pauses. He showed her the latest German imports, praising their artistic discipline and moral order. Vázquez nodded politely, careful to reveal nothing. Over the following weeks, she attended screenings, observed shipments, and gathered information. What she discovered was staggering. Hundreds of film reels were arriving monthly from Europe, routed through Spanish intermediaries. The propaganda network extended through theaters, clubs, and mobile projection units serving rural audiences. In secret, Vázquez began switching select reels with copies prepared in Los Angeles, counter-propaganda films disguised under the same labels. Each substitution was a small act of deception within a larger deception. The modified reels contained subtle inserts, brief scenes revealing the falsity of Nazi news, presented so naturally that only a careful observer would notice. Every swap was a risk. Detection meant arrest or worse. Yet Vázquez continued methodically, relying on timing, precision, and the trust she had built with Krause's staff. One evening, while preparing another exchange inside the distributor's warehouse, she heard footsteps in the corridor. A security inspector, making an unscheduled round. Vázquez froze. The substituted reel was still in her hands. Thinking quickly, she placed it inside a stack labeled for local theaters and stepped away as the inspector entered. He glanced at her credentials, nodded, and moved on. She waited until his footsteps faded, then quietly slipped out. That single moment of calm nearly cost her. The reel she had hidden carried a coded marking meant only for internal intelligence tracking. If discovered, it would expose the entire operation. 2 nights later, the German films were shipped to provincial cinemas. One of the modified reels, now carrying Lawson's embedded counter-footage, reached a theater in Córdoba. There, before an unsuspecting audience, a brief interruption appeared between propaganda scenes. A farmer speaking about hope, a child writing freedom on a chalkboard, a single line of narration. Truth does not fear the light. The splice lasted only seconds, but its message rippled. Local clergy began questioning the origins of the films. Newspapers printed cautious editorials. Within weeks, German cultural offices were scrambling to identify how the breach had occurred. Meanwhile, Vázquez completed her mission and prepared to leave Argentina. But before departing, she received disturbing news from a contact within the embassy. Several of her theater associates had vanished. Rumors spread of interrogations by German agents operating through local police. The network she had infiltrated was far larger and more deeply rooted than anyone had imagined. Carrying documents and photographs detailing Krause's operation, Vasquez escaped the country aboard a merchant ship bound for Miami. When she arrived in the United States weeks later, she delivered her report directly to Vincent Morgan. Her findings shocked the team. The Nazi propaganda network extended across an entire continent, from Argentina to Chile, from Uruguay to Mexico. It reached millions through film, radio, and cultural societies, shaping opinions far from the battlefield. But Vasquez brought back more than intelligence. Hidden inside one of the recovered reels was a fragment of coded message, a warning apparently meant for Berlin. Unknown interference. Possible infiltration. Investigation required. The message confirmed what they feared. Their operation was no longer secret, yet it also revealed something unexpected. The very act of resistance, a few seconds of truth spliced into a web of lies, had proven that propaganda could be breached. Vasquez's courage had turned the tide in a theater of war no one would ever see. Inside Building 23, the team gathered around the returned reels. Morgan, exhausted but resolute, summarized their achievement in a single line. "We've shown that truth can travel, even through enemy film." What came next would test that belief to its limit. For the next battle in the propaganda war would unfold not in secret warehouses, but across the global stage of one of the most pivotal battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad was approaching its climax, and with it, the propaganda war's decisive turning point. By the winter of 1942 into 1943, the world's attention shifted to the frozen ruins of a distant city, Stalingrad. For months, German newsreels had promised inevitable victory. Goebbels's broadcasts spoke of final triumph in the East. American and Allied audiences heard the same message repeated across neutral radio networks. But inside Building 23 in Los Angeles, the secret film team was watching something else. A battle not just of armies, but of perception. Captured German reels arrived weekly through intelligence channels. Each portrayed the same theme: order, confidence, control. The soldiers on screen appeared calm, efficient, victorious. Yet, behind those frames, coded reports from Soviet resistance confirmed the truth. The German Sixth Army was trapped, starving, and desperate. Frank Lawson studied the footage in silence. "They're rewriting the present," he said. "By the time the world learns what really happened, they'll have already won the story." Vincent Morgan agreed. If the Americans waited for official confirmation of the German defeat, it would be too late. The public mind would already be shaped. The team had to act before facts were available. A dangerous task in a war of information, but one that could redefine the conflict. The challenge was clear: expose propaganda without revealing intelligence. Morgan began analyzing the latest German footage for inconsistencies. At first glance, it showed confident soldiers celebrating Christmas near Stalingrad. But when slowed to half speed, clues appeared. Thin summer uniforms, shadows that betrayed winter sun angles, spliced backgrounds reused from earlier reels. The illusion of victory began to unravel under scrutiny. Lawson saw opportunity. "We'll let them prove themselves wrong," he said. The new film project took shape under the code name Crossroads. It would not declare Allied victories or reveal classified positions. Instead, it would teach the audience how to question what they saw. The script followed the same rhythm as the German films, but reversed its purpose. It began with the familiar voice of authority describing German success in Stalingrad, using actual Nazi narration subtitled for context. Then, calmly, the film guided viewers through small but telling details. Notice the shadows. The trees without leaves. Why are the same streets shown in different locations? Why are the same faces used in separate reports? Each observation invited skepticism. No accusation, no rhetoric, only observation. To the audience, it felt less like instruction and more like discovery. By the end of the film, the viewers had learned to detect manipulation on their own. Lawson's editors layered subtle cues beneath the narration. A faint ticking sound during false claims, easing into quiet strings when truth emerged. The pattern wasn't noticed consciously, but it created a rhythm of attention, teaching the mind to pause before believing. The team worked around the clock. Intelligence officers reviewed every frame to ensure no classified information was exposed. Psychologists tested responses with small audiences of soldiers and students. The results were extraordinary. Those who watched the film later reported heightened skepticism toward all propaganda, both enemy and domestic. The War Department approved immediate release through military and civilian channels. The title was changed to The Battle They Cannot Win. It premiered in late January 1943, just as German propaganda reached its peak. Newspapers across neutral countries still carried reports of heroic defense and inevitable victory. Yet within weeks, reality caught up. On February 1943, the German Sixth Army surrendered at Stalingrad. The myth collapsed. For the first time, Nazi propaganda faced public contradiction. Their films of triumph now appeared grotesque, disconnected from fact. International audiences began to doubt everything the Reich produced. Lawson's team had achieved what no bomb could accomplish. They had shattered the illusion of invincibility. In Washington, the Office of War Information quietly celebrated. Internal memos credited the Stalingrad counter-campaign as a major psychological victory. Public morale surged. Allied unity strengthened. Yet inside Building 23, celebration was tempered by fatigue. Weeks of relentless work had left the team exhausted. Ludwig Bennett, who had fled Germany years earlier, watched the news of the Stalingrad surrender with mixed emotion. "I once cut film to make people believe the Reich was eternal," he said softly. "Now I cut film to prove it was not." Lawson, reviewing the first reports of audience reaction, understood the deeper significance. They had not only countered lies, they had taught people how to think critically. This was the true victory, not belief, but awareness. In the following months, the influence of the battle they cannot win rippled across the Western Hemisphere. Neutral newspapers began questioning German news sources. American educators requested prints for classroom use. Even in parts of South America, where Nazi distribution had once dominated, audiences now asked for the American version of events. For Goebbels, it was a psychological defeat of unprecedented scale. He ordered new directives forbidding any mention of Stalingrad in German theaters. Films shifted abruptly from triumph to martyrdom, attempting to reframe defeat as noble sacrifice. But the illusion had cracked. Once people learned to question, control was never complete again. Inside Building 23, the victory brought reflection more than relief. Morgan's latest report concluded with a simple sentence: "The moment people saw error in perfection, the spell was broken." The success of the Stalingrad campaign changed everything. For the first time, American intelligence saw film not merely as morale support, but as a strategic weapon, capable of shaping thought as powerfully as any military offensive. The propaganda war had reached a new phase. No longer about one film or one audience, it was about defining the meaning of truth itself. Lawson gathered his team for a brief meeting before they moved to the next assignment. The tone was somber but resolute. They knew that their success would invite retaliation, that every victory in the war of ideas carried a hidden cost. As the lights dimmed and the last German reel flickered out, Morgan noted quietly in his logbook, "The truth won today. But truth is not immortal. It must be defended again tomorrow." The next battle would not be fought abroad. It would strike closer to the heart, testing the courage, endurance, and conviction of those who fought this invisible war. And soon, that cost would become painfully clear. By mid-1943, the team inside Building 23 had achieved what no one in Washington had thought possible. They had broken the psychological rhythm of Nazi propaganda, turning the enemy's mastery of illusion against itself. But with every success came a quiet erosion of sleep, of certainty, of peace of mind. The propaganda war was invisible, but its toll was not. For Ludwig Bennett, the refugee editor who had once cut film for Goebbels' studios, the cost came in the form of a telegram. His family in Frankfurt, a wife, 2 children, and a sister, had stopped answering Red Cross messages months earlier. Now, intelligence reports suggested that entire neighborhoods once associated with dissidents had vanished. No further explanation followed. Bennett stopped speaking for several days. When he returned to work, he worked without pause, reviewing reels until dawn. Colleagues noticed his notes grew shorter, his edits sharper, his tone more detached. The man who had once lectured on the mechanics of propaganda now spoke only of timing, cuts, and light. He told Morgan quietly one evening, "I cannot bring them back, but perhaps I can erase what deceived them." For Frank Lawson, the loss was closer and more personal. In early summer, a Red Cross bulletin confirmed that his younger brother, Henry, missing since the North African campaign, had been located as a prisoner of war in German hands. Then came the film. Through intercepted footage from Europe, the team recovered a short propaganda piece showing American captives treated humanely by their guards. Among them, Lawson recognized Henry. His brother read a prepared statement praising German order and condemning Allied aggression. The voice trembled. The words were not his own. The room fell silent as the reel ended. Lawson turned off the projector and walked out into the hallway. No one followed. That night, he returned to the editing table and worked until sunrise, recutting a segment of The Battle They Cannot Win. When colleagues asked why, he answered simply, "Because truth has to reach him." 2. Maria Vasquez, still recovering from her mission in South America, learned that several of her local contacts had disappeared after her departure. One had been a young projectionist who helped her swap reels in Buenos Aires. His name never appeared again in official records. The realization haunted her. She avoided social events, slept little, and threw herself into assembling new footage. Sarah Brennan, one of the team's youngest editors, faced her own tragedy. Her fiancé, a naval officer in the Pacific, was reported lost at sea. The news reached her during a morning briefing. She said nothing, returned to her desk, and continued splicing film. Weeks later, she began keeping a small notebook of phrases and narration ideas, fragments about loss, resilience, and the meaning of endurance. Some of those lines would later appear in the closing narration of the team's final film. Inside Building 23, morale wavered. The constant secrecy, the isolation from family and friends, and the growing awareness of what their films revealed and concealed pressed heavily on everyone. Psychologists assigned to the project began rotating members out for rest periods. Few took them. Lawson's leadership changed. He became quieter, more deliberate, less patient with inefficiency. To some, he seemed hardened. To others, simply resolved. He knew the team could not afford collapse. Their mission, however intangible, carried measurable results. A classified report from the Office of War Information arrived that summer. Its findings were clear. American morale had stabilized. War bond sales were up. Recruitment remained strong. In neutral nations, surveys showed a steady decline in pro-German sentiment. Even in South America, audiences favored American newsreels over imported European films. For the first time, data proved that the propaganda counteroffensive was working. Morgan summarized the achievement in his memo to Washington. Measured impact confirmed. Psychological equilibrium maintained. Civilian belief in victory sustained. Yet his private notes told a different story. "We win in numbers, but lose in sleep." The emotional fatigue reached its peak in autumn. When Bennett collapsed during a late-night screening, doctors diagnosed exhaustion and nervous strain. Lawson ordered mandatory rest for half the staff. Though he took none himself, he spent those quiet nights reviewing the footage of his brother again. Not as a director, but as a brother watching another human being trapped inside an illusion. In his journal, he wrote, "Propaganda imprisons even the faces we love." Despite the pain, the work continued. The team understood now that their task was not only strategic, but moral. They were fighting to protect the very idea of truth. Fragile, imperfect, but necessary. When winter approached, Morgan convened a final meeting before the next phase of operations. He stood before the weary group and read a brief message from the War Department. Your efforts have preserved national confidence during the hardest year of the war. Continue with discretion and conviction. There was no applause, no ceremony, only a long silence. Then Lawson said quietly, "Back to work." As they returned to their editing tables, the lights of Los Angeles glittered faintly beyond the blackout curtains. None of them knew that the war in Europe would end within 2 years, or that their contribution would remain hidden for decades. All they knew was that truth, once again, depended on them, and that the price of defending it was one they would keep paying long after the reels stopped turning. By early 1944, the outcome of the war was beginning to turn. Allied forces advanced across Europe. German cities faced nightly bombardment, and whispers of Nazi retreat echoed across occupied territories. Yet inside the sealed rooms of Building 23, the mood was far from triumphant. For Frank Lawson's team, victory brought a new challenge, one more complex than deception or morale. Reports arriving from intelligence units in Europe carried fragments of what the Germans had left behind. Camps, forced labor sites, and industrial facilities dedicated not to production, but to destruction. The accounts were unbelievable, even to those who had seen war up close. Officers described entire towns emptied, human beings reduced to numbers, and evidence of crimes so vast they seemed beyond imagination. The question for the propaganda team was immediate and agonizing. How could such truth be shown and believed? Lawson understood the paradox. The horrors were real, yet so extreme they risked disbelief. If shown carelessly, the footage would be dismissed as fabrication, the very reaction Goebbels was counting on. In March 1944, the War Department summoned Morgan and Lawson to Washington. There, behind closed doors, they were briefed on a new directive from Allied Command: prepare a series of films to document German atrocities for both military and civilian audiences. These would not be propaganda. They would be evidence. The project's code name was The Final Offensive. When they returned to Los Angeles, the team assembled in silence. No one spoke of cinematic style or audience engagement. The purpose had changed. They were no longer shaping perception. They were preserving truth for history. Weeks later, the first raw footage arrived from Europe. Shaky handheld film shot by combat photographers, barbed wire, skeletal figures, heaps of belongings, buildings marked with ashes. The material was almost unwatchable. The team screened it only once per day. Then, the editors worked in shifts, labeling, cataloging, and cutting segments into coherent form. For many, it was the first time they truly saw what they had been fighting against, not the symbols of tyranny, but its consequences. Ludwig Bennett, still frail from exhaustion, volunteered to handle the most difficult footage. As he watched images of the camps, he whispered to no one in particular, "Now the film tells the truth for those who cannot." Lawson faced a moral crisis of his own. He wanted to show everything, to leave no doubt about the reality of what had happened. But Morgan reminded him of their duty. If we overwhelm them, they will turn away. Show enough to reveal, not to destroy. Together, they developed a principle that would guide the final work. Let the evidence speak, and speak only once. No dramatic narration, no music to shape emotion. Only what the camera saw, arranged with clinical clarity. In late 1944, the team trained a new group of combat photographers heading to Europe. Their instructions were precise. Film everything: structures, faces, documents, with steady frames and clear perspective. Every shot might one day serve as proof. When the first Allied forces liberated the camps in 1945, the film units were ready. The images that returned were beyond comprehension. Even the most seasoned cameramen wrote in their diaries that no lens could contain what they saw. Inside Building 23, the footage arrived in metal canisters sealed with wax. The editors opened them in silence. What followed was perhaps the most solemn period in Hollywood's history. Days stretched into weeks as they assembled the material into a single documentary. There were no narrators, no actors, no reenactments, only the mechanical hum of projectors and the measured click of editing tools. The finished film, titled simply Nazi Concentration Camps, was screened privately for War Department officials in May 1945. No one spoke during the entire presentation. At the end, the room remained still for several minutes before a senior officer said quietly, "This must be shown to everyone." The film became official evidence at the Nuremberg trials, projected before the world as proof of Nazi crimes. Judges, prosecutors, and even defendants sat in silence as the images unfolded. The German representatives could not deny what they saw. The lens had recorded too much. When news of the screenings reached America, public response was mixed. Grief, anger, disbelief. But the mission had succeeded. The camera had made denial impossible. For Lawson's team, it was both triumph and tragedy. They had fought a war without weapons, only to discover that the truth they sought to reveal was darker than any fiction. After the war ended in August 1945, the Office of War Information began closing its special projects. The personnel of Building 23 were released from service, their records sealed under classification. The facility was dismantled, its rooms cleared, its lights turned off. Some returned to Hollywood. Others left the industry entirely. None spoke publicly of what they had done. Their names appeared on no credits, their contributions buried beneath the anonymity of government archives. In private journals later declassified, Morgan wrote, "We used illusion to protect truth. We used film to fight the destruction of the human spirit. And when truth arrived, it asked of us more courage than we thought we had." Lawson never directed another government project. His later films, while fictional, carried quiet traces of his wartime work, recurring themes of moral choice, memory, and the cost of silence. For Bennett, the end of the war was not peace but reckoning. He learned that one of his children had survived, hidden by neighbors in rural Germany. Father and son reunited in 1947. In an interview years later, Bennett said only, "The camera remembered when people did not. The propaganda war was over. But the memory of it, and of those who fought it with reels instead of rifles, would remain an invisible legacy. They had proven that light, when shaped with honesty, could reveal even the darkest corners of history."